Act 1: The Wrong Encounter. Peter leaned against his worn-out couch as his phone vibrated. He picked it up and saw that it was Ryan.
Hey, what's up?
Peter answered lazily.
Bro, this is a huge opportunity. I heard that a nearby gang is recruiting new members. I have a way to take you to meet the boss.
Ryan's voice was filled with excitement.
This time is different. I've looked into it. The boss is legit. Don't worry, it's a solid deal.
Ryan assured him confidently. Peter nodded.
All right, I'll come find you in a bit.
Just as he got up to leave, his mother blocked his way. Where are you going again? She crossed her arms, her brows furrowed.
Just meeting some friends.
Peter replied impatiently. Friends? You waste your time every day. Can't you find a proper job? Ever since you were young, you've never followed through with anything. If you keep this up, how long do you plan to drift aimlessly? Her voice carried both disappointment and helplessness. Peter frowned and turned to leave. Wait, his mother suddenly called out. Go visit your grandfather at the hospital. His health has worsened and he's been admitted.
I don't have time. Maybe another day.
Peter said dismissively. His mother sighed. Your grandfather took care of you for 2 years when you were little. Now that you've grown up, you won't even spare some time to see him. Peter fell silent, standing at the doorway for a few seconds. A memory flashed through his mind. 2 years ago, he and Ryan followed a gang leader who was notorious for his ruthlessness. One day, the boss stormed into their hideout, covered in blood, claiming he had killed someone and needed someone to take the fall. The room was silent. No one dared to speak. The boss's sharp gaze swept over them, ready to pick someone. Just then, sirens blared outside, and the police burst in, arresting him. Later, they learned that the boss had found out his second-in-command had scammed people out of a fortune. Driven by greed, he tried to force the money out of him, but things escalated, and he accidentally killed the man. Peter frowned, hesitation creeping into his heart. Finally, he sighed, grabbed his jacket, and said to his mother,
Fine, I'll go to the hospital.
Then he called Ryan. When the call connected, Peter said,
Bro, I gotta visit my grandfather at the hospital. I can't meet you today.
Ryan replied.
All right, I'll just go see the boss myself then.
The hospital lights were cold and sterile, the smell of disinfectant heavy in the air. Peter checked his phone for the room number his mother had sent. 320-something. He frowned and started looking. He reached room 322 and peeked inside, empty. He moved to room 323. The room was dimly lit, and an old man lay in bed, facing away, fast asleep. Peter frowned, took a few steps closer and called softly.
Grandpa, it's Peter.
The old man slowly turned over, revealing a deeply wrinkled face. Peter froze. This wasn't his grandfather. Just as he was about to leave, the old man murmured.
Peter, is that you? You've finally come to see me.
Peter hesitated, turning back to look at him. The old man's eyes were cloudy and lifeless. He could barely see. Before Peter could respond, a nurse quietly motioned him outside into the hallway. This gentleman has been here for nearly 6 months. His vision has deteriorated severely due to complications from diabetes. He's almost blind. He never married, has no children. Only a nephew named Peter. But the two aren't close, the nurse explained in a hushed voice. Peter frowned.
So, he thinks I'm his nephew?
Maybe. His nephew only visited him once when he was first admitted and never came back. Peter glanced back into the room at the elderly man. He wasn't one to meddle in other people's business, but the old man's voice rang out again.
Peter, I have something I need to tell you.
Peter sighed inwardly.
Fine.
He thought.
I'll just listen to what he has to say.
He walked back in, pulled up a chair and sat down.
What is it?
The old man's voice was low, tinged with guilt and regret.
5 years ago, I was working as a janitor at a company. One day, while cleaning the supervisor's office, I found a lottery ticket on the floor. I didn't think much of it and just slipped it into my pocket. Who would have thought? It ended up winning the jackpot. $4 million.
He took a deep breath before continuing.
I was thrilled. No one knew whose ticket it was, so I claimed the winnings and quit my job. But I was never at ease. That opportunity belonged to the supervisor. A few months later, I finally decided to return half the money to him. But when I went looking for him, I found out he had lost everything in a failed investment. His wife left him, taking their child with her. Unable to cope, he fell into depression and stopped working. In the end, he ended up homeless.
The old man's gaze was unfocused as he gently grasped Peter's hand, his voice barely above a whisper.
Please find him for me. I don't want to die carrying this guilt.
Peter remained silent. This was the first time in his life that someone had made such a request of him. What should he do? Act 2. Investigation and inner struggle. Peter left the hospital room and found his grandfather's actual room number. Pushing the door open, he saw his grandfather sitting up in bed. Seeing Peter, his grandfather was momentarily surprised before breaking into a smile.
You actually came to see me?
His grandfather chuckled.
Mom told me to.
Peter shrugged, his tone indifferent, but he still pulled up a chair and sat down. The two chatted idly. His grandfather complained about the bland hospital food, while Peter absent-mindedly responded. But in his mind, the old man's words from earlier kept resurfacing. That lost lottery ticket, the guilt-ridden $2 million. Was it really true? After returning home, Peter tried to push the thoughts aside. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw the nearly blind old man and heard his trembling voice.
Help me find him. I don't want to die carrying this guilt.
In the end, he couldn't suppress his curiosity. The next day, he decided to investigate. Peter arrived at the company the old man had mentioned, a modest-sized office building that seemed to have declined over the years. Standing at the entrance, he took a deep breath and walked in, randomly approaching an older employee.
Excuse me, do you remember a janitor who worked here and left about 5 years ago?
Peter asked casually.
You mean Jack?
The man squinted as he tried to recall.
Yes. I remember him. Honest guy. Why do you ask?
Well, I heard he left suddenly back then, without telling anyone why.
Peter probed.
Yeah, we all thought it was odd. He was a quiet guy, and then one day, he just quit out of nowhere. The employee chuckled. Are you a relative of his? He didn't seem to have much family.
Peter didn't answer. Instead, he continued his questioning, carefully extracting information. Eventually, he confirmed that the story was indeed true. The old man had worked as a janitor here. 5 years ago, he abruptly resigned. And the supervisor from back then? He had indeed lost everything due to a failed investment, leading to the collapse of his family. Now he was reportedly homeless. The only remaining question was whether the lottery ticket part of the story was real. Peter started visiting the hospital more frequently, not just to check on his grandfather, but also to see the old man. The hospital staff even grew accustomed to seeing him visit a patient who wasn't a relative. One day, as he approached the old man's room, he was stopped by a security guard. The guard looked at him sternly and asked,
I heard your actual family member is in the room next door. Why do you keep visiting this patient?
Peter was momentarily caught off guard but quickly responded.
Well, he mistook me for his nephew, so I just went along with it.
The guard's expression softened and he chuckled.
No problem. I was just checking to make sure nothing suspicious was going on. You seem like a good kid, visiting your grandfather, and even looking out for other elderly patients.
After the guard walked away, Peter felt an odd sense of irony. He was just a drifter, someone who had never done anything particularly noble. Yet now, not only was he mistaken for someone's nephew, but he was also seen as a good person. He couldn't help but laugh at the thought. Still, he was starting to notice a change within himself. Before, he thought doing the right thing was foolish, that life was just about having fun. But lately, he found himself questioning that mindset. Was he really okay wasting his life like this? He entered the old man's room as usual, standing beside the bed with his hands in his pockets. His tone was nonchalant.
Hey, I found out that the supervisor really did end up on the streets, but I haven't located him yet.
The old man didn't look surprised. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he had expected this all along. Peter hesitated for a moment before cautiously asking,
But your story, I still don't know if it's true. Honestly, I don't want to go through all this trouble just to find out it was a misunderstanding.
The old man didn't get angry or argue. Instead, he slowly reached under his bed, fumbling for something. Finally, his trembling hand pulled out a worn-out piece of paper, which he handed to Peter.
See for yourself.
His voice was low and steady. Peter took the paper and glanced at it. His eyes widened slightly. It was an official lottery claim form from 5 years ago. In that moment, he finally realized the story was real. As he walked home, Peter's mind raced. This wasn't a small amount of money, it was $2 million. If he found the supervisor, was he really going to hand over the money? Or could he just lie to the old man and take it for himself? He wandered the streets aimlessly, torn between two voices in his mind.
The old you wouldn't have hesitated to take the money. But this is a dying man's last wish.
Peter took a deep breath and gazed down the dimly lit street. Finally, he shook his head and made up his mind. He would find the supervisor first and figure out the rest later. Act 3, finding the supervisor. But Peter stood at the street corner, looking down at the notebook in his hand. It contained the clues provided by the old man's former colleagues, the last known area where the supervisor had been seen. But how was he supposed to locate a homeless man? He frowned, feeling frustrated. Just then his phone rang. It was Ryan.
Hey, Peter. Where have you been? You've been off the radar lately.
Ryan's voice carried a hint of curiosity.
I've been busy.
Peter replied vaguely.
You're not still at the hospital, are you? Whatever, listen, I have something to tell you.
Ryan lowered his voice, sounding excited.
I already met with the new gang leader. Are you sure you don't want in? I can set it up for you.
Not now.
Peter interrupted flatly.
I've been spending time at the hospital with my grandfather.
What? Since when did you turn into a devoted grandson?
Ryan scoffed.
But whatever, it's probably for the best. The new boss is laying low right now. Cops are after him for something, so we don't need to rush into joining.
Peter's eyes flickered at that piece of information, but he didn't dwell on it. Instead, he changed the subject.
Ryan, you're still familiar with the old neighborhood from when we were kids, right? If I needed to find a specific homeless person there, what's the best way?
Ryan sounded confused.
Why are you looking for a homeless guy?
It's for a friend.
Peter said vaguely.
I just need to find someone.
Ryan thought for a moment before saying,
There's an old guy in that area who knows everything about the streets. If even he doesn't know where your guy is, then you won't find him anywhere.
That's a good lead. Thanks.
Peter said before hanging up. Following Ryan's suggestion, Peter went to the part of the city where the homeless gathered. After searching for a while, he finally found the man Ryan had mentioned. Peter handed him a few bills and quietly asked,
Do you know of a man around here who used to be a supervisor? 5 years ago, he lost everything in a failed investment. His wife left him, took their child, and now he's homeless.
The old man took the money, furrowed his brows in thought, and then nodded.
Yeah, I know someone like that. He stays in the next district, doesn't talk much.
Peter felt a spark of hope and immediately headed toward that area. As he entered a narrow alleyway, he spotted a man in tattered clothing sitting against the wall. His arms were wrapped around his knees, his expression blank and lifeless, as if he had long since lost hope in the world. Peter approached and crouched down in front of him, carefully testing the waters.
Did you used to work at Rock Financial Management?
The man didn't respond. Peter tried again.
5 years ago, did you lose a lottery ticket?
The man's body stiffened slightly. Slowly, he lifted his head, his gaze hazy and unfocused.
How do you know that?
Peter looked at him and said slowly,
Someone owes you $2 million and wants to give it back.
Surprisingly, the man didn't react with joy. Instead, he let out a bitter laugh, his eyes filled with deep skepticism.
Is this some kind of joke?
He scoffed.
Who sent you? No one in this world just gives money away, especially not that much.
You don't understand.
Peter insisted.
The person who found your ticket, he felt guilty for taking what wasn't his. He's in the hospital now, and he wants to return half of the winnings before he dies.
The man stared at Peter for a long moment, then sneered.
And you think that money will change anything? 5 years ago, I had $6 million in my hands. I was set for life. I was going to retire, give my family the best. But I got greedy. I believed in a guaranteed investment and lost everything step by step.
He let out a deep sigh and shook his head.
If you're here to mess with me, save your breath. I don't have time for fairy tales.
With that, he turned away, refusing to acknowledge Peter any further. Peter frowned. It was clear the man didn't believe him, or perhaps he had simply given up on life. Either way, convincing him wouldn't be easy. Act 4. Unexpected obstacles. Peter returned home, his mind preoccupied with the supervisor's indifferent expression. He muttered to himself.
He doesn't believe it. He really doesn't believe it. $2 million. Does it really mean nothing to someone who has already given up?
He thought about letting it go. After all, he had done his part. But as he lay in bed, his mother's words echoed in his mind. You never follow through with anything. That one sentence made him sit up abruptly. He had made up his mind. This time he wouldn't quit halfway. 2 days later, Peter returned to where the supervisor stayed, this time with more determination.
I know you don't believe me,
Peter said in a low voice.
but there's someone who wants to speak to you personally.
The supervisor didn't respond.
You have nothing to lose. Just think of it as visiting an old man in the hospital.
Peter continued.
After that, you can decide whether to accept the money or not.
The supervisor was silent for a long time. Finally, he sighed and stood up.
Fine. I've got nothing better to do anyway.
Peter watched him, finally feeling a sense of relief. He had convinced him. Just as Peter was about to take the supervisor to the hospital, his phone rang. It was Ryan.
Hey, did you find the guy?
Ryan's voice sounded slightly uneasy.
I did.
Peter replied. Ryan was quiet for a moment, then said,
I'm nearby. I have something to give you. Can you come meet me for a bit?
Peter didn't think much of it and hung up, heading toward the location Ryan mentioned. But as he walked with the supervisor, something felt off. Turning a corner, he suddenly saw 3 figures blocking the way. 2 of them were unfamiliar men, clearly gang members, their expressions cold and menacing. And standing beside them was Ryan. Peter's heart sank. His instincts screamed that this was a trap.
Peter, I'm sorry.
Ryan's face was bruised, his expression full of guilt. Peter took a step back, quickly scanning the surroundings. One of the unfamiliar men, who seemed to be the leader, spoke first.
So you're Peter. I heard you've been looking for someone.
Peter said nothing, his fists unconsciously tightening. The man sneered.
I also heard you found some homeless guy, and we're talking about giving him $2 million.
Peter's expression darkened. He turned to look at the supervisor, who looked away guiltily and murmured.
I mentioned it to someone I knew. I thought it was just a joke.
The gang leader smirked.
That money belongs to us now.
As he spoke, he reached into his jacket and revealed a gun. Ryan flinched, his face turning pale.
Peter, please help me.
Peter's mind raced. Ryan had betrayed him, but it was clear he hadn't done so willingly. Now they were in serious danger. The gang leader's expression turned impatient.
Here's the deal. Your friend here gives us his bank account details. We take the money, and you both walk away.
Peter let out a cold laugh.
And you think I'll believe that?
The gang leader's face darkened.
You don't? Then how about this? You watch as I blow your friend's head off.
He pressed the gun against Ryan's temple. Ryan froze in terror.
Peter, please.
Peter's pulse pounded. His eyes darted around, searching for a way out. Fighting back wasn't an option. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The only choice was to stall for time. Peter took a deep breath, keeping his voice as steady as possible.
Fine. I'll take you to the hospital.
The gang leader smirked.
Smart choice.
With that, they began walking toward the hospital, the supervisor following in silence. As they neared the entrance, the gang leader stopped. He gestured to his man.
I'm not going in. You follow them inside and make sure they hand over the money.
To ensure their compliance, he kept Ryan outside as a hostage. Then he turned to Peter and ordered.
Give me your phone.
Peter handed it over without hesitation. They stepped into the hospital. and the gang member walking behind Peter lowered his voice.
Don't try anything stupid.
Peter said nothing, but he was already formulating a plan. The hospital was a crowded place. Firing a gun here would draw immediate attention. That was his one advantage. Just as they were making their way through the corridor, a nurse rushed past, pushing an emergency stretcher. A group of medical staff hurried alongside her, momentarily disrupting the walkway. Seizing the opportunity, Peter grabbed the supervisor and swiftly ducked into a nearby room, closing the door behind them.
Where are they?
The gang member's angry voice echoed outside. He frantically searched the hallway, reaching into his pocket for his phone, only to find it missing. Inside the room, Peter looked down at the phone in his hand, the one he had just slipped from the gang member's pocket during the chaos. Without wasting time, he quickly typed a message to the gang leader, deliberately mimicking the gang member's tone.
Boss, found the hospital room, but there are too many people around. Might lose control of the situation. You should come in personally.
After sending the message, Peter took a deep breath, hoping the gang leader wouldn't suspect anything. Now he just had to wait and see if the trap would work. Sure enough, minutes later, security cameras showed a man in a dark jacket entering the hospital. He walked cautiously, his hand tucked into his pocket, gripping something, probably his gun. And with him was Ryan. Peter knew this was his moment. He turned to the hospital security guard he had spoken to before and whispered,
That man is a wanted criminal, a gang leader. He's here to commit a robbery.
The guard's face hardened. Peter added a few more words in his ear, then walked away. Moments later, Peter's stolen phone rang. It was the gang leader.
You think you're clever, don't you?
His voice was laced with fury.
My guy just found me. Said you jumped him and stole his phone.
Peter's smirk faded slightly. The gang member must have escaped and informed the boss, exposing his deception.
So you figured it out.
Peter said, exhaling.
Too bad. Just don't hurt Ryan. I'll take you to the money.
They met in the hospital lobby. The gang leader's expression was dark, his hand tucked inside his jacket, fingers undoubtedly wrapped around his gun, ready to act at any moment. They took the elevator up to the hospital ward. As they approached the supposed room, the gang leader grew impatient.
Open it.
Peter hesitated, his hands trembling as he reached for the door. The gang leader grew frustrated and ordered his man to do it. The door swung open, revealing an empty room. The gang leader's expression twisted with fury.
You're still playing games with me.
He looked around and suddenly realized.
Wait, this is a setup.
He spun around, but it was too late. From the other end of the hallway, police officers had already surrounded them. The gang leader snarled.
Damn it.
But before he could react, he was tackled to the ground, his gun knocked away. His men were also quickly subdued. Peter exhaled deeply. It was finally over. Act 5, Redemption and Change. With the police subduing the gang leader and his men, the hospital finally returned to peace. Peter stood off to the side, watching as the officers pinned the man to the ground, his mind filled with complicated emotions. Ryan, still shaken, walked over hesitantly. His voice was filled with guilt.
Peter, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to betray you.
Peter didn't respond immediately. Instead, he patted Ryan's shoulder and let out a long sigh.
As long as everyone's safe, that's what matters. Just don't get mixed up in things like this again.
Ryan lowered his head, unable to say another word. Peter then turned to the supervisor.
Let's go.
The supervisor seemed caught off guard.
That's it?
Peter chuckled lightly.
Isn't there someone you need to meet?
The supervisor hesitated for a few seconds before nodding. Peter pushed open the hospital room door. The old man lay weakly on the bed, as if he had sensed something. Slowly, he turned his head toward the door. Though his eyesight was almost gone, he seemed to perceive that another person had entered. His trembling hands clutched the sheets as he murmured.
Peter, is that you? Did you bring him?
The supervisor stood at the doorway, looking at the frail old man, with a complex expression.
I remember you. You were the janitor, Jack.
He finally said, his voice slightly hoarse. The old man blinked hard, tears forming in his cloudy eyes.
Yes, that's me. I thought I would never get this chance.
Peter remained silent, watching from the side. He didn't know what to say in a moment like this. The supervisor slowly approached the bedside. The old man reached out with his trembling hand, and after a moment of hesitation, the supervisor took it. The old man's voice was filled with remorse.
I'm sorry. For years, I carried this guilt. I knew this money was never mine, but it took me far too long to make things right.
The supervisor let out a quiet chuckle and shook his head.
Do you know what really ruined me? It wasn't losing that lottery ticket. It was my own greed, my obsession with wanting more.
The room fell into a brief silence. Then the old man smiled faintly.
At least we've both come to realize it now.
The supervisor nodded slightly, his eyes reflecting a rare sense of relief.
Yeah.
The old man took a slow breath and turned to Peter. His voice was gentle.
Kid, come here.
Peter raised an eyebrow but stepped closer.
You don't need to come anymore.
The old man said softly.
I've known all along. You're not my nephew.
Peter's eyes widened slightly.
You knew.
A faint smile appeared on the old man's face.
At first, I was mistaken, but the more you spoke, the more I realized it. Still, I chose to pretend, hoping you would help me fulfill this final wish.
He patted Peter's hand weakly.
And you did. Thank you.
Peter was momentarily speechless, feeling something indescribable stir in his heart.
Here, take this.
The old man said, pointing to the small drawer beside the bed.
Write down what I say.
Peter grabbed a piece of paper and pen, jotting down the string of letters the old man dictated. Then, the old man reached into his blanket and pulled out a small USB drive with trembling hands, handing it to Peter.
This is for you. A small reward. There are only 2 things inside.
Peter frowned.
What's in it?
The old man smiled mysteriously.
Check it when you get home.
As they left the hospital room, the supervisor looked at Peter and asked.
What did he give you?
Peter twirled the USB drive in his fingers.
A flash drive and a string of characters. He said there are only 2 things inside.
Hearing this, the supervisor froze for a moment before unexpectedly chuckling. He patted Peter's shoulder and said,
That might be Bitcoin. 2 of them would be worth quite a lot now.
Peter's eyes widened.
Wait, what?
Seems like he knew this day would come.
The supervisor said with a sigh.
Maybe this was his way of thanking you.
He turned and walked toward the hospital window, looking out at the street below.
Money can make people fall, but sometimes it can also change them.
Peter stared at the USB drive in his hand, feeling a mix of emotions. After this ordeal, the supervisor took half of the money to rebuild his life, while the other half was used to establish a fund to help the homeless reintegrate into society. As for Peter, he used the old man's reward to start thinking about his future. He no longer wasted his days aimlessly, but instead decided to do something more meaningful with his life. Later, he and Ryan started a small business. It wasn't anything grand, but at least they were living honest lives. Peter also continued visiting the hospital, checking in on the old man regularly. A few months later, the old man's condition worsened, and eventually he passed away. In the end, all of his remaining assets were donated to charity. Standing in front of the old man's grave, Peter murmured,
Thank you for changing my life.
He glanced at Ryan beside him, and then let out a small laugh.
Come on, we've got things to do.